Clark died in an accident during a Formula 2 race in West Germany.
Because this shy, modest man, the son of a Scottish sheep farmer, was never one to trumpet his own skills.
I started as an amateur with no idea or no intention of becoming world champion, but I was curious to find out what it was like to drive a car fast, to drive on a certain circuit, to drive a certain type of car.
Clark's speed and talent was spotted by Lotus boss Colin Chapman. Clark soon set the motorsport world alight, in which, in 1963, he won his first F1 World Championship.
Oh my God! I am sitting where Jim Clark sat! Oh, this is electrifying! These were not powerful cars! They only made 210 brake horsepower for 1.5 litres, but they were still good for 180 miles an hour.
Thanks to its revolutionary monocoque chassis, the 25 was stiffer and lighter than any other F1 car, which meant it wasn't just fast on the straights, but quicker through the corners too. And in the 1963 season, Clark used it to win a record 7 out of the 10 Grand Prix.
Winner is Jim Clark. Nobody could possibly catch him now.
But 1963 was just a warm-up for what was to come. To get a true picture of Clark's genius, we must look at another year, 1965, when he hit heights no driver had reached before, or has done since. A modern Formula One driver does 21 races a year and often complains that's too many. In 1965, Jim Clark raced in 63 races. Some of these cars look similar, but they are all completely different. In a car like this, he'd do Formula One Championship. He raced in the British Formula 2 Championship and the French Formula 2 Championship in this car. He raced in the Tasman Series, a sort of Australian Grand Prix for Down Under, in this car. And then there's this Lotus Cortina, in which he decided to race in touring cars. And then if all that wasn't enough, he decided to go for the Indy 500. First up was the Tasman Series in Australasia. Out of the 15 races, Clark won 11 and took the crown. Then it was back to Europe for the British and French Formula 2 Championships, both of which he won.
Jim Clark led from the start.
Winner is Jim Clark.
And in between the F2 races, he was jumping into his Lotus Cortina and racking up touring car victories. And on top of all that, there was America.
The Indianapolis 500 has been called the greatest spectacle in racing.
America's most prestigious race would be a tough challenge. Oval racing at higher average speeds than he was used to against seasoned Indy veterans. For the Indy 500, Clark raced a specially developed Lotus producing just shy of 500 horsepower. However, although he already had a Formula One world title to his name, the Scotsman's CV cut no ice with the sniffy Indy officials, who made the upstart from across the pond take a rookie driving test before he could compete. Come Indy weekend, the upstart from across the pond qualified on the front row. And then, in the race itself, Clark, up against America's finest oval racers, won by just over 2 minutes.
Jim Clark, first European to win at Indianapolis since 1916, set a new record of 150.686 miles per hour.
So what was it that made Clark so good? What was it that made him capable of winning in any type of car?
Jimmy was an absolute natural driver, and he did it without thinking. He didn't know why he was driving in this style the way he did. In the period that we're talking about, we had 1.5 litre cars, 200 horsepower. If you drove the car too hard, you would scrub the speed off. And if you lose a bit of speed, it's very difficult to actually make it up again. And that's what Jimmy had the knack of, keeping the momentum of the car going. I don't think that any of the modern drivers could have driven the car anywhere near as quickly as Jimmy did, because he was just so precise.
Besides a supernatural ability to coax speed out of the car, Clark also possessed another vital skill.
A lot of very good racing drivers died in Lotuses because the Lotus was a very fragile car. But Jim Clark was so smooth that he never put too much stress on the areas of a car that would give up.
After the race, when you stripped his car down and you stripped his co-driver's car down, you could always tell which parts came off Jimmy's car and which parts came off the other driver's car, because the parts of Jimmy's car were more or less pristine.
But don't think for a minute that Clark was one of those drivers that could only win in a perfect car. One year at Spa, for example, he was leading the race when his gearbox started to let go. Did he give up? Nope. Instead, he drove the rest of the race, and we're talking 160 miles an hour in the wet, with one hand on the steering wheel and the other holding the gear lever in place. And he still won by nearly 5 minutes. As the 1965 season rolled on, Clark, having won both Formula 2 championships, the Tasman Series, and the Indy 500, now faced one remaining challenge. The biggest challenge, the Formula 1 world title. At the season's opening race in South Africa, up against such legends as Jack Brabham, Graham Hill, and reigning world champion John Surtees, Clark won by half a minute, and did so while suffering from a slipped disc. Next up was Spa, and then the French Grand Prix, both of which he also won. Next up was Silverstone, and here it looked like business as usual, with Clark leading the pack. However, in the closing stages, his engine was starting to lose oil pressure.
While Clark is driving with no oil pressure on his gauge, Hill, storming up behind, breaks the lap record in his efforts to pass.
Eventually, the F1 circus arrived at the Nürburgring, a circuit where Clark had never won. Leading from pole, Clark finally broke his Nürburgring jinx, winning the race and with it, the Formula 1 world title. So let's just sum up Clark's season of 1965. Of the 63 races he contested, he won a staggering 31 of them and was on the podium a further 8 times. He was now seen as the greatest racing driver of all time, in demand the world over. Yet this shy Scotsman chose to mark the year's achievements with a modest celebration at his hometown back in Scotland. The next 2 years, by contrast, were a disaster, with multiple mechanical failures denying him another championship. However, in 1968, driving the Lotus 49, another game-changer from Colin Chapman, Clark took the first win of the year in South Africa and looked set for another dominant season.
Congratulations, Jim. This is absolutely splendid effort. Okay, thank you very much.
And then, on the weekend of April the 7th, Clark had a choice of 2 races he could compete in. One at Brands Hatch, the other a Formula 2 race at Hockenheim. Fatefully, he entered the German race.
April the 7th is a bad day for me. He wasn't happy. It was freezing cold and damp, misty. We could not get any heat into the tyres. Couldn't get any temperature in them, no matter what we did. Jimmy said to me, Father, I do not expect anything from me today. Just keep me informed with the pit board, where I am, how many laps to go. That's the last thing he said.
On lap 5, Clark's car suddenly speared off the track at 170 miles an hour.
Jim Clark, he's a god. And the first time I saw him, my God, I can't believe it. And you actually talking to him. It was awe-inspiring. Life is worth living. For me, it's tearful. I'm sorry.
According to the medical report, Clark died instantly of a broken neck, and the crash was later put down to a deflating tyre. When he died, he was just 32, but in his short career, he had racked up some truly incredible achievements. In Formula One, he won 25 of his 73 races, which in percentage terms puts him way ahead of Hamilton, Vettel and even Schumacher. In pole positions, he had 33, which again in percentage terms makes him second best of all time, just behind Fangio. Then there are the Grand Slams. That's where a driver gets pole position, fastest lap, the win, and leads every lap of the race. Schumacher has 5 Grand Slams to his name. Senna, 4. Jim Clark, 8. That's more than any other driver in history. You might imagine that a man with such skills would be rated highly by other drivers. And you'd be right.
I was invited to a cocktail party for Fangio, and he said to me, in my opinion, Jimmy Clark was the greatest racing driver ever. And coming from Fangio, there's no better compliment than that.
In 1991, the reigning world champion made a special pilgrimage to the school to pay his respects. Of Clark, Senna said simply, he was my boyhood hero. He was the best of the best. And like Senna, Clark died when he was driving at his absolute peak.
That was it.
Most of what I was able to do in motor racing was done by the manner in which Jim Clark drove, and I just followed him.
He was a gentleman. He was a gentleman and a gentleman. It's a pity he's not around now, because it'd be nice to have him.